Hey folks, Nick Cousvis here. We're talking about Livescope, talking about baits that work really well with Livescope. You know, we use so many different baits, and some are Livescope friendly and some not so much. But let me talk about the baits that I use when I'm using Livescope to scope a fish to get them to bite. Obviously, the first one we're going to talk about, pin minnow. Everybody knows. Anybody that watches any tournaments or anything knows about pin minnow, straight tail minnow, however you want to call it, fork tail, basically like that. We use it on a ball head or some kind of shad head, jig head, and it could be really anything from 332 all the way down to say a 3/8, even ½ ounce in some cases, depending how deep you're fishing. You know, I try to match the weight of the jig head to the depth that I'm fishing. You know, in a lot of cases, what people don't realize is how much weight that plastic has. So you start getting into 16th ounce, you're like, man, that seems kind of light, but there's a lot of weight to that plastic. So 16th ounce, some of these plastics might even be upwards of a 1/4 ounce, even up to 3/8. So it adds a lot. So going to a lighter head is going to promote a slower and more natural fall. In a case where you're fishing really deep and those fish are down at the bottom, then yeah, going a little bit heavier and getting that bait to get down a little bit faster. Maybe you're in a little bit of wind, your feel is going to be a little bit better. But generally, I'm like a 16th to 1/8 ounce is what I use most of the time. In most cases, fishing 25 feet in. If I'm a little bit deeper, I may go heavier, or if conditions are different, I may go heavier. But that's it right there. You know, the key to this bait is, key to really scoping fish is keeping the bait above where the fish are. So I'll cast it out there, watch that bait come down towards the fish. And when I'm, you know, 5 feet, 3 feet away, then I'm kind of lifting that bait to keep it above their head, and then they shoot up and grab it. And you know, it could be like real subtle shakes. And you'll notice a lot of this comes down to practice. Shaking it too hard, that bait wants to jump and do a lot of this. It doesn't look very natural. The key is to keep it at that depth, and just little twitches, giving it that real subtle roll is the key. And a lot of that you'll see. The other reason why we do this is because you see how that fish is reacting to that bait when it's going down. It's showing you that fish comes up, looks at it, turns away. Casting accuracy is really key to using these pin minnows, getting over their head, letting it come down to them. They already know it's coming, and then keeping it above their heads to get bit. All right, so the next bait that I really love is basically a traditional swim bait. You know, and they come in many different sizes, whatever. But this is another great scoping bait. This one here is a 3-inch spark shad. I just have it on a shad head, whatever. I use a bunch of different things. That's about a 1/4 ounce. But again, you know, 1/8 ounce all the way to like 3/8 is kind of generally what I use. And the difference between this and a pin is that, you know, I want to cast it out there same way. I want to get it right over their head, let it flutter down real natural. The lighter head gives you a more natural fall. A heavier head is going to give you more of a quicker fall that may not look as natural. So I always say get away with the least amount of weight that you can with the conditions and the depth that you're fishing. But playing around is definitely key. But you know, you cast it out there over the fish's head, and again, just like the pin minnow, accuracy is real key. If you're off that fish, a lot of times you spook them. You don't get right on them. So getting it right over their head, watching that bait fall, and it'll fall down in like a circular motion. Once you get it down close to above their head, then I just start to retrieve. And my retrieve with this is just a very steady, subtle retrieve. Just slow, slow. I don't want to get any lift. I want to keep it at that depth, and they'll come up and eat it. You know, and again, the paddle tail, thing about this spark, it's got a real subtle action, very natural in these clear lakes. If you're fishing a dirtier lake, you might want to go to something a little bit more aggressive, like a Kitech fat or something like that, that's got more of a thump. But in clear water, these natural swim baits like this spark shad is real key. So another bait that's really good when you're scoping, one of my favorites, is the jerk bait. Now this is the Megabass 110, very, very popular. Anybody that knows jerk baits knows the 110. I use it a lot. This is one of my favorite baits. Catch a lot of fish and a lot of big fish on it. This is a great scoping bait, and mainly because A, you could see it really easy, and B, suspends. So I can get that bait to get down to the depth I want, desired depth, and stop it, and now the bait's just sitting there, and the fish will slowly come up. Now, the cool thing with the scope is that you see how those fish react. It's amazing. One thing I thought about, because I grew up fishing jerk baits a lot, never got to see it unless it was in ultra shallow water. I didn't know what was going on. You're casting to a target, hoping that a fish comes up to eat it. Now, this bait, unlike the soft baits, I don't mind casting this bait a little bit past the fish, because I want to reel it down to the depth that I want. So if I made the cast right at the fish, and now I started winding it down, by the time it gets to the depth that I need it to, it's too far away. So I want to cast it past the target, reel it down. Now I'm in that right. Now I can start giving it those little subtle twitches, and the fish will come up and eat it. So very key, past the fish, bring it down to the fish, and then start working it. Awesome bait, play around with it. A lot of guys do it down south, but I don't see a lot of guys doing it up north. It is a great bait, catches a lot of fish and big ones. So one of the last baits I want to talk about, and I mean there's lots of other baits, but these are my favorites, and this is a bait that a lot of guys don't use, and I'll explain, is a deep diving crankbait. A lot of guys don't scope a crankbait. I use my live scope to lock in on, generally when I'm throwing these baits, I'm throwing around weed lines, you know, high spots, could be grass, could be rock. I'll cast that bait far past. I put the target kind of in between me and the furthest cast, get that bait to dive down. Now I might be working an edge. So when I'm using my live scope, I'm trying to line up my cast with the edge of that weed line. And the reason I do that is because now I don't get hung up as much. I know exactly where that weed line starts, where it comes down, and I know I'm able to make like a 45-degree cast and get that bait to come down and just tick off the tops of the weeds, not get stuck in it. You know, sometimes you can't see the weeds and you make a cast the wrong way and you just end up getting into the biggest, thickest part of it. You basically waste the cast. This way I'm making very precise casts, marking that edge and getting that bait to dive right down along that edge where that strike zone is. Those fish will just sit inside that edge, whether they're on the bottom or suspending up. They'll come out and dart it, grab it, and eat it. You know, when you stop this bait, it floats up. I can stop that float a little bit just by turning my reel and keeping it at that depth. Get it, come up a bit, twitch it, reel it back down again, and see how those fish are reacting. The other thing it allows me to do, it allows me to fish an area of the weed line where I know there's some fish. I see some bait around. I might see the odd fish swimming out. So I'm really targeting a very high percentage area, and it allows me to cover water faster and not make, you know, a lot of casts to places and spots that aren't really high percentage areas where fish are hanging. So I love this bait. Again, you know, any kind of deep diving bait when I'm fishing around weeds, and I get a lot of big fish on them. This is a real big fish bait, particularly in August, September, October. Man, so many big fish. I just came back from a trip in the Finger Lakes, caught some really big largemouth on this bait. You can see it's all scuffed up, scratched up. Man, they eat it. That's another bait. So, you know, there are other baits. You know, you can scope a chatterbait if you want. I know a lot of guys say you can't, but I find situations, again, where I'm using the live scope to mark areas in that weed line and make very precise casts them, because I know that's 50 feet away, 40 feet away, and I'm not getting hung up as much. I'm catching more fish. So play around with these baits, play around with the live scope, take some of the tips that I showed you and go out on the water and play around. Again, the only way you get better is to learn, and sometimes sacrificing some hours playing around with some baits that you generally don't when you're live scoping is going to help you be a more efficient angler. And again, like I've always said, adding another arrow to your quiver is always a good thing. That's a nice fish. You know, 4-pounder, not like the one I lost, but beautiful. Let's put him back.